Why did the richest empire in history go broke? How does a nation that controlled global trade, owned half the map, and minted money in its own image end up begging for loans? And here's the real question. How does an empire that built modern banking get destroyed by its own balance sheet? Because make no mistake, the British Empire didn't collapse from rebellion or invasion. It collapsed from interest. It wasn't a military defeat, it was a financial one. This is the story of how debt, not war, bankrupted the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and how that same system, the one Britain built, still governs the world today. Picture London in the late 1800s. Horse carriages roll over cobblestones, banks glow with gaslight, and every corner of the map is painted red. The British pound is the global reserve currency. The sun never sets on the empire, not because of geography, but because of credit. Every colony, India, Africa, the Caribbean, sends its wealth to the City of London. Gold, silver, cotton, sugar, tea, opium all flow through British banks. But behind the gold and grandeur was a truth almost no one saw. Britain's wealth wasn't real wealth anymore. It was borrowed. The empire didn't just trade goods, it traded debt. London was the world's lender and borrower at the same time. It borrowed to build ships, fund wars, finance railroads, and maintain colonies, then lent that money back out to others at interest. It was a brilliant illusion, a global pyramid of credit resting on belief. The British discovered early that you don't have to own land to control it. You just have to own its debt. In 1694, the creation of the Bank of England changed everything. It gave the Crown a way to fund wars without raising taxes by issuing bonds instead. Investors would lend money to the government, which would promise repayment with interest backed by future taxes. That system, government borrowing from private investors, became the foundation of modern finance. And it worked. Britain used that leverage to outspend and outlast every rival. France, Spain, the Dutch, even Napoleon. Each war deepened its debt, but also its reach. The empire learned that credit could conquer more efficiently than cannons. Every colony became collateral. Every victory required another loan. And as long as investors believed in the pound, the empire could keep expanding. By the 19th century, Britain was untouchable. Half the world's trade passed through London. British banks financed American railroads, Asian ports, and African mines. The empire printed prosperity on borrowed money, and it seemed infinite. Debt wasn't seen as danger, it was seen as genius, because every loan built something new: ships, factories, infrastructure. And as long as trade flowed, interest could be paid. It was the golden age of leverage. The empire looked immortal. But leverage cuts both ways. The more you borrow, the more you need everything to keep working perfectly forever. One slowdown, one shock, one war too many, and the machine seizes. Then came 1914, and the illusion cracked. The First World War changed everything. For the first time, the empire needed money faster than it could extract it. To fund the war, Britain borrowed on a scale never seen before, issuing war bonds, raising taxes, and taking massive loans from the United States. Factories worked non-stop. The pound was still strong, but the cost of global dominance was bleeding the empire dry. By 1918, Britain won the war, but its debt had exploded from $700 million to nearly $7 billion. It owed billions to America. The pound was no longer backed by gold, it was backed by faith. And faith, as every empire learns, has limits. After the war, Britain tried to pretend nothing had changed. It wanted to restore the old order, to prove the empire was still the global banker. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor, made a catastrophic decision. He put the pound back on the gold standard. He wanted to show the world that Britain was still as stable and trustworthy as before, but the world had changed, and the economy couldn't bear it. By fixing the pound to gold at pre-war rates, Britain instantly made its exports too expensive, its industries uncompetitive, and its workers unemployed. Factories closed. Strikes erupted. The empire was now fighting not enemies abroad, but its own mathematics. Then came 1929, the Great Depression. Global trade collapsed, markets froze, and with them, Britain's financial illusion shattered. The colonies that once poured wealth into London now struggled to feed themselves. India, once Britain's greatest asset, became an unbearable cost. Britain couldn't afford its empire anymore, but it couldn't afford to lose it either. In 1931, Britain finally abandoned the gold standard again, a quiet admission that the empire could no longer back its currency with reality. The empire was surviving on inertia, an economy addicted to its own debt. World War II sealed the fate. Once again, Britain borrowed, but this time not for profit or expansion, for survival. To fight Nazi Germany, it mortgaged everything it had left: gold reserves, foreign holdings, colonial assets. The Lend-Lease program from the United States kept Britain afloat, but it came at a cost. By 1945, Britain owed over £21 billion in today's money, more than double its entire GDP. It had won the war militarily, but lost the financial war completely. Its ships were outdated, its colonies were restless, its currency was exhausted. The empire that once financed the world couldn't pay its own bills. When Britain fell, the United States rose, not by force, but by finance. In 1944, as World War II neared its end, nations met at Bretton Woods to design a new monetary order. The US dollar, backed by gold, became the world's reserve currency, replacing the British pound. The empire didn't end, it just changed headquarters. The global system Britain had created, debt, trade, and currency supremacy, lived on, only now it wore an American flag. And Britain? It spent the next half-century managing decline, repaying debts, losing colonies, and pretending prestige was still power. Here's the bigger pattern. Every empire, from Rome to Britain to America, goes through the same economic life cycle. Stage 1, productivity. Real goods, real trade, real growth. Rome mined silver, Britain built ships, America built industries. Stage 2, expansion. Trade increases. Wealth flows in, confidence builds. Credit expands, borrowing becomes normal. Stage 3, financialization. Wealth shifts from production to speculation. Money makes more money. Banks become more powerful than kings. Stage 4, leverage addiction. The system needs debt to function. Borrowing replaces innovation. Growth depends on more credit. Stage 5, collapse. Debt outpaces income. Interest outpaces trade. Currency loses faith. Empire loses power. That's how Rome fell, that's how Britain fell, and that's the same road modern powers are walking now. Here's what most people miss. The British Empire didn't really die, it mutated. The flag disappeared, but the system survived. The colony became the corporation, the navy became the market, and the British pound became the US dollar. The method stayed the same. Control through debt, not domination. Governments don't need to invade anymore, they can land. Colonization became monetization. Today, international loans, currency pegs, and trade deficits are the new empire, managed not from palaces, but from central banks. The British model of control through credit is now the global operating system. The world didn't escape the empire, it became one. By the time Britain made its last debt payment to the United States, in 2006, the empire had been dead for decades. But that final transaction was poetic. The empire that once financed half the world had spent nearly a century paying back the cost of its own illusion. Debt outlived the flag. And that's the real story, not the fall of Britain, but the endurance of the system that killed it. Because the mechanics never changed. Nations still borrowed to appear strong. Currencies still inflate to maintain control, and economies still reward those who issue debt, not those who repay it. Every empire believes its credit is eternal. Every empire learns it isn't. Britain believed its pound would rule forever. It didn't. America believes the same about the dollar. It won't. Because empires don't collapse when they lose power. They collapse when they lose trust. And trust, in money, in credit, in value, is the most fragile empire of all. Empires aren't built with armies anymore. They're built with interest rates. They rise on belief and fall on math. And the British Empire, the greatest financial machine of its time, proved that even the strongest system can't borrow its way out of decline. This isn't history repeating. It's history running on schedule. This is Money Decoded. If you want to understand how the game really works, not the version they teach you in school, subscribe and let's keep decoding.